Hello, welcome back to Module 4 of Working with EEG Data. And this lesson is about the types of EEG data analysis. So, in the previous lesson, we learned that EEG data comprises of 4 dimensions, which is time, space, frequency, and power and phase. Each dimension has specific properties that can provide us with valuable information. So here are the key questions that we're going to address in this lesson. What is time domain analysis? What is frequency domain analysis? And what is time frequency domain analysis? All right, so when it comes to time domain analysis, we usually think of event-related potentials. An event-related potential, or ERP, is the measured brain response that is the direct result of a specific sensory, cognitive, or motor event. More formally, it is any stereotype electrophysiological response to a stimulus. ERPs are not the only analysis that are possible in the time domain. There is also microstates and multi-scale dynamics, or fractal-based dynamics. But ERPs are the dominant form of analysis in the time domain. So here you can see a bunch of single trial EEG data. The number here corresponds to the trial number, and the x-axis indicates time in milliseconds. And time zero is when, so time zero is like when the stimulus appears in front of the subject. So here you can see that individual trials can be variable, so there is like a lot of variability over different trials. But in this plot on the right, you can see all of the 99 individual trials in gray. And the black part here is plotting the ERP, which is the average of all of these trials. So to compute an ERP, you take all of the trial voltage fluctuations at each time point and average them together. So it's just sum and divide by n, and that gives you the ERP. So when looking at this plot, the ERP is kind of smaller in magnitude compared to single trial fluctuations in gray. And ERPs tend to be an order of magnitude smaller than the voltage potential fluctuations of the individual trials. So you can get very different interpretations of this. So one interpretation is that single trial data is very noisy. So the large fluctuations may be indicative of like a lot of brain noise or measurement noise. And so by averaging over the trials, we can get rid of the noise and focus on the relevant parts of the signal. Alternatively, these fluctuations can be interpreted as important signals that could be relevant for understanding cognitive processes, and you can lose them in the time domain averaging. And the graph at the bottom sort of shows the same ERP but more zoomed in, so you can see it in finer detail. All right, and the next type of EEG data analysis is frequency domain analysis. The idea of frequency domain based analysis is to represent and analyze the signal not in the time domain but in the frequency domain. So on the top left, you can see the time domain, and here's a 1 second tick mark, so this is in 2 seconds total. You can see that the signal has 3 peaks per second, so this is 3 Hertz, as shown here at the bottom for the amplitude versus frequency plot. And so figure A2 is the representation of the signal in figure A1, and figure B2 is the representation of the signal in figure B1, and so forth. And you can see that in figure B1 is oscillating much faster and has a lower amplitude of around 8 Hertz. So that's why the amplitude of the frequency here is lower compared to figure A. And finally, figure C is the sum of the signals from figures A and B. So you can see that the constituent parts, the components of the signal in figure C1 is much easier to identify in the frequency domain in figure C2 compared to the time domain in figure C1. So this advantage of the frequency domain is much more prominent in this signal on the upper right figure. So this looks like a very complex and noisy signal, so it's difficult to identify how many different components are in this signal in the time domain, but in the frequency domain it's much easier. So we can see that there's around 1, 2, 3, 4 sine wave components of this signal, plus some like low amplitude broadband noise in here. So it's easier to talk about this signal in terms of the frequency domain. And you will learn how to get to the frequency domain in the next section using a famous signal processing method called Fourier transform. So one of the main disadvantages of the Fourier transform is that it doesn't show us temporal information. All of the temporal information is actually in the Fourier transform, but in the phases, which are not generally shown. But from the results of the Fourier transform, it's difficult to determine exactly when different frequency components are present. So in this plot, we can say that there's such and such hertz component in the signal, say like 8 hertz or something. But from this plot, with only the frequency domain, it is not possible to determine whether the 8 hertz component is constant over time in the EEG signal, or whether there is a very strong hertz in the very beginning, or whether it appears in short bursts, and so forth. So we can get none of these temporal dynamics in these plots, but in fact, these temporal dynamics are things that we should be interested in because the brain is very dynamic. The brain is highly non-stationary, so a solution to this is doing Morlet-wavelet convolution. So instead of getting the dot product of the EEG data with a sine wave like in Fourier transform, we do the dot product of the EEG data with a Morlet-wavelet, which I won't discuss any further since it's out of scope, but feel free to look more into wavelet convolution if you're interested. All right. But that part about trying to obtain both temporal and frequency precision is what time frequency domain analysis is all about. Unfortunately, there's a trade-off between temporal dynamics and frequency precisions, which I won't go into detail how, but in general, if you try to get high temporal precision, you lose some frequency precision and vice versa. But anyways, with time frequency domain analysis, we can have plots such as this, where you can see time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis with smaller numbers corresponding to slower oscillations and higher frequency numbers corresponding to faster oscillations. And the color or the depth in the plot corresponds to a variety of features that we can obtain using a time frequency based approach. So in this particular example, power is plotted, and here power is converted to a decibel change from baseline. So power refers to the energy in the signal, and so red means relatively higher amplitude oscillations, and blue would means relatively lower amplitude oscillations relative to the pre-stimulus baseline. All right, so we just covered the main types of EEG data analysis, including time domain analysis, frequency domain analysis, and time frequency domain analysis. And that's all of section 1. So, and in the next section of module 4, we will be going over EEG signal processing. So I'll see you in the next section.